Late November 1944, Camp Crossroads, Missouri. The chill of early winter crept through the wooden barracks, curling mist over frost-hardened ground and making the air sharp with the scent of pine and damp earth. Inside, approximately 1,000 German female POWs shuffled through narrow hallways, their footsteps muted on the cold floorboards. Rumors had circulated that a church service would be held that Sunday, an invitation personally extended by the camp's chaplain. The initial reaction among the women was disbelief. Many had never encountered a gesture so openly generous from their captors, and suspicion clung to them like the winter chill. Some whispered that it might be a ruse, a test of obedience, or simply an empty formality. A German nurse later wrote that she could hardly imagine why soldiers who had captured them would offer anything resembling kindness, let alone a spiritual service meant for their benefit. When the morning of the service arrived, hesitant lines of POWs wound toward the camp's small chapel, their breath fogging in the cold air. As they entered, the warmth of the room struck them immediately. The low murmur of American voices, the soft resonance of hymns, the steady flicker of candlelight casting gentle shadows along the walls. The chaplain, along with a handful of local volunteers, greeted them with quiet smiles, not questions, not demands, only welcome. For these women, who had spent months navigating the rigid discipline of captivity, the atmosphere was almost surreal. The prayers spoke of peace and reconciliation, the hymns carried familiar yet distant melodies, and the messages emphasized moral reflection and the possibility of hope even in dark times. Many prisoners later described the experience as disarming, their skepticism slowly giving way to a cautious sense of trust. The inclusivity of the service amplified its impact. Women of varying religious backgrounds, Protestant, Catholic, and otherwise, found themselves participating together, united by ritual rather than rank or nationality. The American chaplains made a conscious effort to frame the service as a space of equality and dignity, a sharp contrast to the hierarchical and ideological structures they had known under Nazi influence. One prisoner recalled the simple yet profound shock of realizing that she could voice her own prayers freely, that her conscience mattered, and that the Americans overseeing the camp genuinely respected her as a person. In that quiet hour, the animosity she had expected from captors softened into a fragile recognition of shared humanity. What began as skepticism transformed into an understanding that these acts of care, these deliberate gestures of moral and spiritual outreach, were both genuine and revolutionary in the context of wartime captivity. By the end of the service, the women returned to their barracks carrying something more than the memory of hymns or spoken words. They carried the notion that captivity need not erase dignity, that gestures of kindness could exist even between enemies, and that human decency might survive the machinery of war. Camp Crossroads became emblematic of a broader strategy employed across the Midwest and southern United States, an intentional, humane approach to prisoner treatment where faith, empathy, and moral guidance intersected with military policy. These first services in late 1944 foreshadowed the gradual emotional and psychological transformation that chaplains sought to cultivate, setting the stage for the broader narrative of moral rehabilitation that would define German POW experiences in American camps. Early 1945, far beyond the confines of American POW camps, news of the church invitations began to ripple back to Germany. The German military high command and government officials had initially been completely unaware that Allied forces were extending such gestures to prisoners. Reports trickled in from intelligence channels, carried by word of mouth from liberated prisoners, letters or intercepted correspondence. The reaction in Berlin was cautious, tinged with disbelief. Some officials, steeped in the doctrine of total war, interpreted these acts as psychological maneuvers designed to weaken the morale and ideological loyalty of German soldiers. They suspected subtle manipulation, a way to present American captors as humane while eroding the prisoners' allegiance to the fatherland. Yet others, perhaps less hardened or more attuned to human decency, recognized the possibility that these invitations were sincere, acts of compassion in the midst of relentless conflict. Within the camps themselves, the contrast could hardly have been more striking. German female POWs, many of whom had been raised in a culture where obedience and ideological conformity were demanded above all, were often deeply moved by the warmth extended toward them. Letters and post-war testimonies describe an almost palpable astonishment, the realization that captors could offer kindness without strings, that they could respect faith and individual dignity even in the shadow of war. Some women later reflected that these services were the first moments in months where fear gave way to cautious relief, and that the simple act of being invited to pray or sing together created a profound emotional impact. For many it was disorienting, even unsettling, to confront an enemy who treated them not merely as prisoners, but as human beings worthy of moral consideration. The broader implications of these reports were significant. Allied camps, particularly in the Midwest and South, showcased a stark divergence in treatment between the Axis and Allied powers. Whereas Nazi policy often emphasized harsh discipline, ideological indoctrination, and the suppression of personal conscience, American initiatives like chaplain-led services underscored respect, inclusivity, and moral responsibility. To the German authorities, this was both baffling and threatening, a reminder that warfare could be waged not only with weapons, but with ethics, empathy, and psychological strategy. To the prisoners, it was a revelation, a tangible demonstration that the Allies claimed not only military superiority, but also a moral high ground, using humane treatment as both a tool of diplomacy and a quiet assertion of values. The ripple effect of these early church services would continue to shape prisoner expectations and perceptions, setting the stage for broader discussions of reconciliation, reintegration, and the long shadow of ideological contrast between captor and captive. By late 1944, as the number of German POWs in the United States swelled, the sheer logistics of housing and sustaining thousands of captives became an intricate challenge. Across the Midwest and southern states, the U.S. military constructed a network of camps, each equipped with rows of wooden barracks that creaked under winter winds, modest medical facilities with the sharp scent of antiseptic lingering in the air, and open recreational spaces where prisoners could stretch their legs under watchful eyes. Every detail was meticulously planned. Bunks were stacked neatly, communal mess halls ensured orderly feeding, and infirmaries provided rudimentary but reliable care. Supplies of food, clothing, and medicine flowed from military depots and sympathetic local communities, forming an invisible backbone that maintained the prisoners' basic well-being. The steady rhythm of deliveries, inspections, and routine checks underscored the scale and precision of the operation, leaving prisoners occasionally stunned by the apparent efficiency and order of their American captors. Amid this structured environment, the integration of spiritual life became a vital component of camp policy. Chaplains from Protestant, Catholic, and occasionally Jewish denominations were stationed at key facilities, their presence ensuring that religious services could be offered regularly and without disruption. Local congregations often contributed, donating hymnals, candles, and other materials, while volunteers assisted in preparing the chapels and organizing gatherings. The result was a system that allowed prisoners to attend worship on a predictable schedule, blending routine with the rare opportunity for introspection and comfort. The hum of daily life in the camp, the scrape of boots, the clatter of mess trays, the distant ringing of the chapel bell, created a framework in which religious services became not just symbolic gestures, but tangible elements of mental and emotional sustenance. For the German women, this infrastructure reinforced a subtle but profound message. Even in captivity, their dignity and humanity were being recognized. Reliable access to meals, clothing, medical care, and spiritual guidance fostered a sense of security that contrasted sharply with the uncertainty and deprivation many had endured in wartime Europe. Reports from the camp suggest that the presence of chaplains and organized services contributed measurably to morale, providing structured opportunities for reflection, conversation, and community. In many ways, the system itself, the seamless coordination of material and moral care, embodied the United States' broader philosophy toward prisoners, that humane treatment, when consistently applied, could mitigate fear, cultivate resilience, and even reshape perceptions of the enemy. These logistical foundations would become critical in sustaining the ongoing program of religious services, ensuring that each invitation to a chapel was both credible and accessible, setting the stage for the deepening psychological and emotional impact on the POWs. On a humid July morning in 1944, the rolling fields of Virginia and Pennsylvania were pierced by the distant clatter of trucks and the low hum of activity as thousands of German prisoners of war arrived at newly established U.S. camps. For many of these men and women, the sudden shift from European battlefields to the expansive American countryside was disorienting. A German nurse later recalled the scent of cut grass and coal smoke mingling with the metallic tang of barbed wire, a sensory tableau entirely unlike the war-torn villages they had left behind. Among the prisoners were nearly 425,000 Germans, men in Wehrmacht-Uniforms, Luftwaffe-Personell, and a smaller yet notable number of women who had served in communications, medical, and clerical roles. For these women, captivity carried the same physical confines as their male counterparts: fenced enclosures, guard towers, and regimented routines. Yet unlike the grim stories of Soviet or Japanese camps circulating in rumor, American POW facilities operated under strict adherence to the Geneva Convention. Food was abundant by European wartime standards, and prisoners received medical care, clean bedding, and occasional recreational opportunities, such as organized sports or library access. The German prisoners' astonishment was not limited to the material conditions. Fenny found the conduct of American soldiers and civilians almost unfathomable. Officers who had endured relentless propaganda about the ruthlessness of the Allies were perplexed to see guards treating them with courtesy, even allowing personal correspondence and small comforts from local communities. It felt like an entirely different war, one captured medic later noted, observing women in his unit quietly knitting or reading in the shade without fear. This cognitive dissonance was magnified in the cases of female POWs. For them, the opportunity to attend church services in modest chapels on campgrounds was initially met with skepticism. Raised in a culture where enemy engagement was synonymous with brutality, the sight of American chaplains extending invitations was startling. Some feared hidden motives, others suspected it was a propaganda stunt, but the routine persisted. Services offered choice hymns, quiet reflection, and a moment of spiritual solace in a foreign land. The contrast was stark, and the psychological impact profound. Reports suggested that letters home from female prisoners often contained bewildered accounts of kindness, almost impossible to reconcile with their previous wartime indoctrination. Even the camp commanders noted how this gesture seemed to shift attitudes subtly, fostering small conversations between captors and captives about faith, morality, and humanity. While the women remained prisoners, their perception of the enemy was quietly transformed. No longer were the Americans solely faceless soldiers. They became human beings capable of compassion and decency, capable of offering sanctuary rather than merely confinement. This nuanced approach to captivity, grounded in law, ethics, and practicality, would foreshadow the broader post-war interactions between nations, illustrating how treatment during war could ripple far beyond the battlefield. As summer deepened across the American heartland, these experiences set the stage for a deeper exploration of how ordinary gestures, like an invitation to worship, could unsettle assumptions and sow the first seeds of reconciliation within the grim realities of War II. March 14, 1945, Camp Papago Park, Arizona. The desert sun stretched across endless sand dunes, bleaching the barbed wire fences and casting sharp shadows across the camp's barracks. Inside one unusually quiet building, a small group of German female POWs stood at the threshold, eyes wide with disbelief. The announcement had come that morning. American chaplains were inviting them to attend a church service. For women who had spent months in captivity under strict routines, this gesture was almost incomprehensible, a moment of kindness in a world otherwise dominated by conflict and suspicion. One prisoner later recalled the smell of the creosote boards, mixed with the faint aroma of incense from the chapel, the soft echoes of hymns bouncing against the walls, and a light warmth that contrasted starkly with the cold, regimented order of their daily lives. This invitation was not a spur-of-the-moment act. It was part of a carefully considered policy by the U.S. military. Chaplains from various faiths, often armed with little more than their robes, and the conviction that moral rehabilitation mattered as much as physical security orchestrated these services. They arranged interfaith gatherings, ensuring that Protestant, Catholic, and even Jewish prisoners could participate if they wished. Reports from camp staff suggested that these measures were designed to provide emotional and spiritual support, a recognition that war's dehumanizing effects did not end at the barracks gates. For many German women, accustomed to the rigid doctrines of Nazi ideology, this respect for personal faith was shocking. Some wrote later that they had never experienced an authority figure who seemed genuinely concerned with their inner lives, not just their labor or compliance. The American approach contrasted sharply with the indoctrination these women had endured at home. Under Nazi rule, religious practice had often been marginalized or subordinated to the state's ideological priorities. Expressions of moral concern or compassion were frequently viewed with suspicion, and many had grown up in an environment where obedience and ideology outweighed personal conscience. To suddenly find themselves offered not just freedom to pray, but encouragement to do so, created a profound emotional dissonance. One officer's report from Camp Papago Park noted that some POWs entered the chapel with skepticism, yet left with a sense of restored dignity, a response that seemed as strategic as it was humane. Chaplains carefully cultivated this environment of respect, seeing spiritual welfare as integral to post-war reintegration. By fostering the prisoners' psychological resilience and moral reflection, they hoped to ease eventual return to civilian life. Accounts suggest that providing a structured yet voluntary religious space helped prisoners cope with homesickness, guilt, and the lingering fear that the outside world might still view them only as enemies. The initiative was also part of a broader American understanding that humane treatment could reduce unrest in camps, encourage cooperation, and even subtly counteract Nazi indoctrination, a psychological and ethical dimension of wartime policy often overlooked in the broader narrative of military operations. As the weeks progressed, the impact became evident. Prisoners attended services regularly, sometimes lingering after for quiet conversation with chaplains or fellow inmates. They described moments of introspection, prayers whispered for families back in Germany, and the odd sensation of hope amidst confinement. The German nurse later reflected that she had expected only strict discipline and fear, yet instead found a fleeting sense of community, however fragile. That was nearly impossible to reconcile with everything she had known. This carefully orchestrated intersection of faith and policy not only softened the harshness of captivity, but also offered the first tangible glimpse of life outside the rigid structures imposed by war, a humanizing bridge from enemy to fellow human. These church services at American POW camps illustrate the profound cultural and psychological strategies embedded in wartime policy. By attending, German prisoners encountered not merely religion, but a demonstration of respect, empathy, and dignity, concepts that had often been denied under the Third Reich. While the broader war raged on, in these small chapels across the United States, the quiet work of moral and emotional rehabilitation began to take root, foreshadowing the challenges of reintegration that awaited millions once the guns fell silent. From this point, the narrative shifts naturally to explore the ways in which chaplains, through repeated gestures of care, subtly reshape the daily lives and attitudes of prisoners, preparing them for a world that demanded not just survival, but reconciliation. By early 1945, the practice of inviting German female POWs to attend church services had spread far beyond the initial camps in Missouri, reaching facilities in Texas, Arizona, and Pennsylvania. Across these disparate landscapes, from the sun-scorched deserts of the Southwest to the cold, gray mornings of the Northeast, chaplains and volunteers extended the same gesture of welcome, creating pockets of unexpected warmth within the otherwise rigid confines of military captivity. The reactions of the prisoners varied widely. Some women, emboldened by prior experiences, engaged fully, joining hymns with tentative voices that soon gained confidence, bowing their heads in prayer and responding to messages of peace with quiet reflection. Others lingered at the edges of the chapel, hesitant, observing the proceedings with a mixture of awe, disbelief, and cautious curiosity. A German nurse in Arizona later described the sensation of being enveloped in light and song, a stark contrast to the harsh discipline and ideological rigor of the environment she had known in Europe. The very act of participation, voluntary, inclusive, and sincere, challenged deeply ingrained expectations of captivity and authority. The services themselves became more than routine gatherings. They evolved into a potent symbol of the American philosophy toward prisoners. Hymns carried familiar melodies across foreign soil. Prayers spoke not of conquest, but of reconciliation, and chaplains consistently emphasized the dignity of the individual alongside spiritual reflection. The careful repetition of these rituals, regularly scheduled, meticulously organized, and conducted with genuine care, reinforced a sense of consistency and reliability that was almost revolutionary for prisoners conditioned to expect only orders and surveillance. Reports from Pennsylvania noted that even women initially reluctant to attend eventually returned, drawn by the serene atmosphere and the subtle power of witnessing humane behavior extended toward former enemies. Each service became a quiet assertion that morality and empathy were not casualties of war, but weapons of a different kind, capable of shaping attitudes, fostering respect, and planting the seeds of reconciliation in the minds of those long immersed in ideological conflict. For many POWs, these repeated encounters with kindness slowly reshaped perceptions of the enemy. The contrast between life in an American camp and the authoritarian, ideologically charged structures they had left behind was stark. Letters and post-war reflections indicate that the women were often astonished at the sincerity of the chaplains and volunteers, realizing that gestures of compassion could coexist with military authority. The expansion of these church services thus became emblematic of a broader American strategy. Humane treatment was not merely incidental, but deliberate, creating moral as well as psychological impact. In the quiet of chapels across the country, prisoners experienced moments of introspection, community, and tentative trust, experiences that would linger long after the war, shaping not only memories of captivity, but the possibility of future reconciliation and understanding between former adversaries. Spring 1945, in barracks and chapels scattered across the Midwest and Southwest, German female POWs began to confront the emotional weight of the invitations extended to them. At first, many were bewildered. The very idea that their captors would offer something so unbidden as a chance to attend church seemed almost impossible. Letters and post-war testimonies describe a sense of confusion that lingered as the women approached the chapels. Hesitant steps on worn wooden floors, the faint scent of candles and hymnals mingling with the lingering aroma of military rations. Disbelief was common. The soldiers and volunteers who greeted them with warm smiles, gentle guidance, and genuine patience defied every expectation, shaped by months of captivity and years of wartime indoctrination. For some, gratitude soon replaced skepticism, a quiet acknowledgement that they were being treated not as enemies or numbers on a roster, but as human beings with moral and spiritual needs. Inside the chapels, the atmosphere fostered reflection and introspection. Soft beams of sunlight slanted through dusty windows, illuminating hymnals held carefully in trembling hands. The sound of collective voices rising in song, joined by chaplains' prayers of peace and reconciliation, offered a rare moment of normalcy amid the rigid routines of camp life. Prisoners often reported that these services became a sanctuary, a brief reprieve from the monotony, fear, and uncertainty that defined their days. Some used the time to silently pray for family left behind in a war-torn Europe. Others simply absorbed the calm, the structure, and the shared human presence, discovering a strange comfort in communal ritual. It was an experience wholly unfamiliar, one in which the enemy showed concern for their moral and emotional well-being rather than exploiting fear or enforcing obedience. The psychological impact extended beyond the chapel walls. Many POWs described a subtle but profound shift in their perceptions of the Americans around them. Guards, chaplains, and volunteers, who once seemed distant or impersonal, became figures of decency and empathy, human faces within a machine of military control. A sense of hope began to emerge, fragile but real, accompanied by resilience that helped prisoners navigate the lingering trauma of war and captivity. These small acts of kindness, regular invitations to worship, Gentle words of encouragement, attentive care, served as reminders of shared humanity. For women conditioned to expect hostility or indifference, the contrast was staggering, leaving an impression that endured long after the last hymn faded and the doors of the chapel closed. In these moments, the war's broader violence receded, replaced by an understanding that even in captivity, the moral compass of the captors could illuminate the possibility of compassion, dignity, and survival. By mid-1945, it became clear that the American practice of inviting POWs to church services carried implications far beyond individual morale. Treating prisoners with dignity and respect was not merely a humanitarian choice, it was a calculated demonstration of moral authority. The United States sought to set an example for the world, emphasizing that even in the midst of total war, adherence to ethical conduct remained possible. Reports from German intelligence channels noted the growing astonishment among POWs, many of whom shared with authorities the unexpected kindness of their captors. This quiet diplomacy undermined the carefully cultivated Nazi propaganda that depicted the Allies as ruthless and unfeeling, exposing a stark contrast between ideology-driven brutality and American adherence to principles of humane treatment. For the German prisoners themselves, the contrast was jarring and, in many cases, transformative. While they had been trained to expect strict control, surveillance, and ideological instruction, the chaplain's services offered voluntary spaces for reflection, spiritual solace, and personal agency. The psychological effect rippled outward. Prisoners began to internalize the idea that not all enemy forces were inherently cruel, that decency could exist even amid violence, and that moral leadership was a powerful tool in shaping behavior and perception. American military leaders recognized this as a form of soft power. By modeling ethical conduct in captivity, they could foster long-term respect, cooperation, and ultimately reconciliation after the war. The humanitarian framework reinforced the notion that victory was not solely measured in territorial gains or military might, but also in the capacity to uphold human dignity under extraordinary circumstances. This strategy also carried subtle tactical advantages. Humane treatment reduced unrest and resistance within camps, promoting orderly conduct and easing the administrative burden of managing large numbers of prisoners. At the same time, it encouraged prisoners to view their captors less as faceless enemies and more as moral exemplars, which in turn weakened the psychological grip of Nazi ideology even while the women remained far from home. Letters, memoirs, and post-war reflections consistently highlight the enduring impression these services left. The unexpected kindness of the Americans instilled hope, resilience, and an understanding that conflict could coexist with compassion. By demonstrating that ethical treatment of prisoners was both possible and practical, the United States effectively waged a battle not only on the physical front, but on the moral and psychological plane, setting a precedent that would resonate long after the guns fell silent. Despite the profound impact of church invitations, the practice was not without its limitations. In early 1945, as chaplains and volunteers worked tirelessly to reach prisoners in camps from Texas to Pennsylvania, they encountered obstacles both practical and cultural. Not every German female POW was receptive. Some remained skeptical of the Americans' intentions, hesitant to step into chapels that seemed almost too welcoming, or deeply influenced by years of indoctrination that equated enemy gestures with deception. Participation varied widely, with some women attending regularly while others observed quietly from the margins, struggling to reconcile their expectations with the reality of kindness. These emotional hesitations were mirrored by logistical challenges, overcrowded barracks, limited space in makeshift chapels, and the finite availability of hymnals, volunteers, and chaplains often constrained how many prisoners could be included in any given service. Moreover, the practice was uneven across the network of POW camps. While facilities such as Camp Crossroads in Missouri or posts in Arizona became known for consistent services, other camps, particularly smaller or more remote installations, were slower to implement similar programs. These inconsistencies highlighted the broader challenges of administering humane treatment across thousands of prisoners in diverse and dispersed locations. Recognizing these gaps, the U.S. military adapted quickly, prioritizing the allocation of chaplains, supplying hymnals, and coordinating with local churches to ensure that as many prisoners as possible could participate. Even when attendance was limited, the effort itself conveyed a message of respect and care, demonstrating a commitment to the moral as well as physical welfare of captives. In this way, the limitations of the program did little to diminish its overall significance. The persistence and adaptability of the chaplains and camp authorities ensured that the humane intentions behind the services continued to reach prisoners, leaving lasting impressions of dignity, empathy, and the unusual but powerful experience of being treated as human beings rather than mere numbers in wartime. As the guns fell silent in Europe and 1945 gave way to peace, the echoes of those chapel services lingered far longer than the uniforms and barbed wire ever could. German female POWs returned home, carrying more than memories of captivity. They carried vivid recollections of moments when their captors had extended genuine kindness. The faint scent of candle wax, the gentle resonance of hymns, and the soft greetings of American chaplains remained etched in their consciousness. Many shared these experiences with family, friends, and even future generations, recounting how a simple invitation to a church service could disarm suspicion, soothe anxiety, and restore a sense of humanity. Letters and memoirs describe an almost ineffable sense of gratitude, a realization that amidst the violence and upheaval of war, acts of empathy could endure and leave a lasting impression on the human spirit. The legacy of these services transcended individual memories. In post-war Germany, survivors of the camps reflected on the chaplains' gestures as examples of moral courage, illustrating that even in the darkest times, compassion could prevail. Similarly, in the United States, these stories were shared to reinforce the values of empathy, respect, and ethical conduct, demonstrating that the treatment of prisoners could serve both practical and moral purposes. The narrative of POWs attending services became emblematic of a broader principle, that reconciliation and understanding were possible even between former enemies. For the women who experienced these moments firsthand, the chapels were more than physical spaces. They were symbols of hope, of dignity, and of the enduring possibility that human decency could survive the harshest realities of war. Through these services, the U.S. military not only mitigated the immediate hardships of captivity, but also helped sow the seeds of a more compassionate post-war world, a legacy that continued to shape perceptions of morality, reconciliation, and the power of kindness long after the last POW returned home. As the war drew to a close, the German female POWs who had attended church services were repatriated to a homeland scarred by destruction, loss, and the lingering weight of ideology. Yet even amid rubble and uncertainty, the memory of those chapel services remained vivid, a touchstone of unexpected kindness that contrasted sharply with the harsh realities they had endured. The gentle voices of chaplains, the warm glow of candlelight, the familiar hymns, these impressions lingered like echoes of another, more humane world. For many women, these experiences became more than mere recollections. They were markers of hope and resilience, reminders that even in captivity, compassion could endure and that human dignity could survive amid war's dehumanization. Returning home, the POWs carried these lessons with them, sharing stories of generosity, patience, and moral courage with families, neighbors, and later generations. Letters, memoirs, and oral histories recount how these services challenged long-held assumptions about the enemy, opening hearts to reconciliation and understanding. The acts of kindness experienced in American camps became a quiet but powerful narrative of moral triumph, illustrating that even in the midst of global conflict, gestures of empathy could leave lasting impressions on individual lives. These women emerged not only with memories of hardship, but also with the knowledge that civility, respect, and spiritual solace could bridge divides imposed by ideology and war. In this way, the church services extended their influence far beyond the boundaries of the camps, leaving a legacy of compassion, moral reflection, and hope that would endure for decades, shaping post-war perspectives on humanity, reconciliation, and the enduring capacity for kindness in times of strife.